Tonight, Boeing 737 MAX 9 planes grounded and questions being asked over their safety. Frantic US and EU diplomacy to avert an escalating conflict, 3 months on from Hamas's October 7 attack. A woman in her 90s rescued from the rubble of Japan's New Year's Day earthquake disaster.
And there it is. He's now a top 10 player when the rankings come out next week.
And Australian Alex de Minaur achieves a career ambition on his home court. I'm Janice Petersen. This is SBS World News. Good evening. The US air safety regulator has temporarily grounded some Boeing 737 MAX 9 aircraft. It's in response to a terrifying emergency over the western state of Oregon. A panel of an Alaska Airlines jet blew off during the flight. There were no fatalities, but authorities say the accident could have been far worse. Australia's Civil Aviation Safety Authority says there are currently no Boeing 737 MAX 9s flown by any airlines here.
Only the sound of wind whipping through the cabin. A different story in the cockpit.
We'll have to go down.
Flight 1282 in distress 6 minutes after takeoff.
Just because we're declaring emergency, we need to descend down to 10,000.
At 16,000 feet, nearly 5,000 metres, with 171 passengers and 6 crew on board.
And I just feel the plane drop, and it wasn't like any other turbulence just because the masks had came down too. So that's when I knew, like, oh gosh, this is something way different. And yeah, I started freaking out.
Her incredulity shared.
I look to my left and there's this huge chunk, part of the airplane just like missing.
Portland International Airport, from which the plane had departed, bound for California, preparing.
We are ready for the approach and we'd like to do the approach.
A gaping hole behind the left wing.
There was, I guess, a boy and his mother were sitting in that row, and his shirt was sucked off him and out of the plane.
The crew landing Flight 1282 with no major injuries. The US National Transportation Safety Board on scene and not minimising what could have been.
We are very, very fortunate here that this didn't end up in something more tragic. No one was seated in 26A and B.
Those seats next to the missing portion known as a plug. It replaces a door which is not needed as the plane was configured with fewer seats than the original design.
On 26A and 25A, the headrests are gone. On 26A, part of the seat, the back of the seat is gone.
Alaska Airlines temporarily grounding its fleet of 65 Boeing MAX 9 aircraft. The particular aircraft only delivered to the airline on November 11.
Had the aircraft been at higher altitude, at cruising altitude, maybe more passengers would have unbuckled their belt, could even have been moving back the cabin, and then certainly would have been a risk of loss of life.
Issues with the Boeing 737 MAX aircraft are not new. In 2019, an Ethiopian Airlines crash killed all 157 passengers, which followed a crash of Indonesia's Lion Air the year before. Portland Airport once again busy as shaken passengers prepared to fly.
That's kind of crazy that that's something that actually happened. That's something that you see in like horror movies.
And while horror was averted, the Boeing 737 MAX 9 now under the closest examination. Pruluwan, SBS World News.
3 months after the latest escalation between Hamas and Israel broke out, frantic diplomatic efforts are underway to contain it. The EU and US have both sent their top diplomats to the region as Israel's northern border with Lebanon is seeing some of its heaviest combat yet.
The skies over the Israeli-Lebanese border shrouded in smoke. after one of the heaviest days of fighting in recent months. Hezbollah says it launched 62 rockets at an Israeli surveillance base, a preliminary response, it said, to the killing of Deputy Hamas chief Saleh al-Aruri in Beirut. The few who remain in Israel's all but deserted border towns, constantly shaken by shelling.
התעוררתי עם הזעקות, זה כבר רגיל, זה פעמיים וגם יום שישי זה היה, הזעקות. אבל נפילות לא היו בתוך העיר, נפלו באזור שטחים פתוחים, באזור המושבים, קיבוצים.
Israel appeared to intercept some of the rockets and launched strikes of its own on Hezbollah positions. This as the EU's foreign policy chief arrived in Beirut, trying to prevent another full-scale war.
It's absolutely necessary to avoid Lebanon being dragged into a regional conflict. This is the last thing that Lebanon needs. And I am sending this message to Israel too. Nobody will win from a regional conflict.
The US's top diplomat dashing around the region with the same warning. He's been in Turkey, Greece and Jordan since yesterday and still has 6 stops left.
We'll be looking at what we can do to maximize the protection for civilians, maximize humanitarian assistance getting into them, and also to get hostages out of Gaza. Far too many Palestinians have been killed, especially children.
And more are being killed by the day. This hospital in central Gaza said it received 46 bodies overnight. In the southern city of Khan Yunis, children first displaced, now orphaned.
قالت لي واحنا من الليل عند خالك عيسى واحد عند خال عيسى قصف الضوء وانا عندهم استشهدوا اخواتي وابوي يا رامي عوض واخوي الصغير تقريبا صف ثاني واخوي معاذ الكبير صف ثامن وابوي وامي.
International pressure on Israel is mounting, but the Prime Minister says the war will continue.
לפני 3 חודשים החמאס ביצע בנו טבח נורא. הממשלה בראשותי הנחתה את צה"ל לצאת למלחמה כדי לחסל את החמאס, להשיב את חטופינו ולהבטיח שעזה לא תהיה עוד איום על ישראל. אסור לעצור את המלחמה עד שנשיג את כל היעדים הללו.
On the first goal, the IDF says it's now completely dismantled Hamas's command structure in northern Gaza.
עדיין יש בג'באליה מחבלים. רק כעת הם פועלים ללא מסגרת וללא מפקדים. נתקלנו וגם ניתקל. בירי רקטי ספורדי מהמרחב הזה. תקפנו אותו ונמשיך לתקוף.
But on the hostages, still no update. Their relatives joining thousands in an anti-government protest in Tel Aviv. 3 months after they were taken, more than 120 people remain captive. Claudia Farhart, SBS World News.
On the 3rd anniversary of the January 6th US Capitol attack, new footage has emerged of angry protesters trying to break into the House of Representatives. Widely circulated footage and images show the situation from the interior. But for the first time, this video shows what happened on the other side of the door.
This is our house! This is our house! Our house!
Our house!
How do you handle this?
Open the door, brother!
How do you handle it?
Come on, man, open the door!
More than 950 people have been charged with federal crimes relating to the riot. 3 people were arrested this week. It appears the secrecy around the US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin's hospitalisation went beyond the public, with the US President unaware for days. Mr Austin has accepted full responsibility. Yesterday, the Pentagon announced that Mr Austin had suffered complications from a recent elective medical procedure. Rescuers in Japan have pulled an elderly woman alive from the rubble 5 days after the magnitude 7.6 quake hit the country's west coast. Rain and snow is now hampering recovery efforts, and authorities are turning their attention to retrieving bodies still trapped in the debris. More than 120 people are now confirmed dead and around 200 are still unaccounted for.
digging through snow with hand tools in a desperate bid to find victims. Dozens of police officers work in 2-hour shifts, battling fatigue and frostbite, hoping to uncover the remains of 4 people who lived here.
According to information we received, they were at the house when the earthquake hit, and they've now been reported as missing, so we're here to find them.
These officers aren't from Wajima City. They've come to help from neighbouring provinces. They found human remains here this morning.
We're digging carefully through the rubble, but the snow is coming so quickly that we have to work even faster. The snow makes it even more difficult to find what we're looking for.
This entire city block in Wajima City looks like a war zone, thanks to a major fire that swept through here after the earthquake. Today, it's blanketed in snow, making the painstaking task of searching through the rubble even more difficult. The fire so intense, even a week later and under snow, the rubble is still smouldering. In Suzu, against all odds, a woman in her 90s pulled alive from the rubble more than 5 days after the quake struck. 72 hours is considered the upper limit of survival. She withstood 124 in the bitter cold. Adding to the disaster, torrential rain, rescuers forced to halt search efforts in Anamitsu after a landslide killed several people and trapped close to a dozen more. There have been more than 1,000 aftershocks since New Year's Day, and many here now live in constant fear. Ayuko Noto's home withstood the quake, but she and her family now sleep in their car, afraid it won't withstand another.
Aftershocks are still continuing, so we're choosing our car over our house so we can flee right away in case another major earthquake strikes.
Many people across the Noto Peninsula remain cut off. The military now evacuating elderly residents from isolated areas. They will now join the tens of thousands who remain displaced.
And Aaron Fernandez joins us tonight from Nanao on the Noto Peninsula. Good evening, Aaron. The situation there very tenuous still. We understand there's been an earthquake warning for the region today.
Yes, it really is, Janice. Good evening to you. We were driving just a couple of hours ago and we received a message from Japan's meteorological agency advising an early warning of an earthquake. We only have preliminary information at the moment, but we understand a 4.5 magnitude earthquake was recorded and there was no tsunami warning that followed the recording of that earthquake. But these are the situations that rescue workers and locals here on the Noto Peninsula are really wary of at the moment. There is so much infrastructure, buildings, power lines that's hanging precariously since the New Year's Day earthquake, and that could collapse at any minute. The aftershocks and any further earthquakes are a real threat and a real danger for the people still here. The conditions today, the snow, we saw how it is impacting the rescue and recovery efforts. There was a Defence Force helicopter that was meant to be carrying supplies to communities that are cut off at the moment. Those trips had to be abandoned because of the snow, and still here on the Noto Peninsula, there's no running water, there's no electricity, there's no sewerage in most of the major towns that have been affected. But as part of all of that, there was that really positive news out of Suzu today, a 90-year-old woman surviving 5 days trapped under the rubble. Usually it's 3 days that people are given to realistically survive this kind of ordeal, but she managed to survive even longer than that. So even in these really dire circumstances, a very positive outcome here on the Noto Peninsula.
Indeed, a rare glimmer of hope there in some very challenging times. That's SBS Asia correspondent Aaron Fernandez reporting from the Noto Peninsula on the Japan earthquake recovery. Well, still to come, a cyber scam where exchange students appear to be kidnapped. Also, polls open in an election where opposition candidates are on strike. Also, police search for a link between multiple stabbing attacks in Melbourne. And later, the tough, flexible and very thin product with potential to boost computer speeds. Voters in Bangladesh are going to the polls in a national election marred by a boycott by the main opposition party and the arrest and detention of protesters. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is expected to win a fourth consecutive term, with observers questioning the credibility of the country's democratic institutions.
Looming large over the country's political landscape, there is no escaping Sheikh Hasina's hold over Bangladesh. First elected to the prime ministership in 1996, she has, over the years, consolidated her position as the country's longest-serving leader. One of the first to cast her ballot in this election, staying in power has come at a price. Opposition leaders such as Khalida Zia have been jailed, others exiled, and protesters arrested. The Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the country's main political opposition, has boycotted the polls and called for a 48-hour nationwide strike.
We are protesting against a fraudulent election. It is absolutely a farce election. They are snatching our voting rights, the people's voting rights. So it's not an election at all. We want voting rights. We want democracy.
A liberal and visible use of the country's military, ostensibly to safeguard the electoral process, leaving observers concerned.
What we are seeing is really a silencing of freedom of expression. So all this has escalated in the last year, and therefore we downgraded Bangladesh's rating from repressed to close, which is the worst rating of civic space a country can have, and therefore it's quite worrying.
Arson attacks on trains, nationwide strikes, and calls for civil disobedience have all been blamed on the opposition's attempts to protest the vote. Regardless, the country's election commission taking its assignment seriously.
We are convinced that the public servants who will be handling the election or polling and allied matters, they will be sincerely, honestly and faithfully discharging their duties. And we are hopeful election will be free, fair and credible.
A hopeful sentiment for a fragile democracy struggling with a tainted election and the ever-present prospect of violence. Edmund Roy, SBS World News.
Thousands of mourners have attended the funeral of a Pakistani Sunni Muslim cleric. Masudor Rahman Usmani was gunned down by an unidentified gunman in Islamabad. No one's yet claimed responsibility for the attack, but police say they're using CCTV as part of their investigation. The UN's World Food Programme has warned that 1.4 million Sudanese refugees are at risk of starvation. A shortage of funds has left the organisation to cut food aid. Many refugees have sought safety in the town of Adre in eastern Chad, near the border with Sudan.
A lifeline for Sudanese refugees in Chad as a shipment of food aid arrives from Cameroon. Inside the central warehouse of the World Food Programme, more items for the 1.2 million refugees. But aid agencies are warning the signs aren't looking good for those who fled the fighting in Sudan.
At this point in time, we don't have enough funding to continue to respond at the scale that we are.
Unaware of the looming crisis, Aida Abu Hassan prepares the evening meal for her family.
We have nothing to eat, but I boil corn flour so the children don't sleep on an empty stomach. We don't have flour, rice or sugar. It's just corn flour mixed with hot water.
Like 200,000 other refugees, the family is yet to move to permanent camps and cannot access much of the aid. As the funding dwindles, officials warn time is running out for hundreds of thousands.
If we don't do it now, it might be too late. It might be too late to come in, because if we do it later, it means that the social fabrics that is there will not be into existence anymore.
Chadian authorities are left with the difficult task of sharing resources with the refugees.
Nous comptons pour faire extension de différents camps.
We have decided to expand the camps, take in more refugees just like those housing the first wave of refugees in 2003. But right now we are overwhelmed by the numbers still coming into Chad, which is huge.
Aid agencies say every day 200 to 300 refugees arrive in the border town of Adre through this crossing point.
The United Nations says it requires $1.2 billion this year to help Sudanese refugees in eastern Chad. This is $300 million more than what was required last year when the Office of the Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs was able to raise less than half of what was required.
There are worries here that new global flashpoints are diverting attention from the plight of Sudan's refugees. This means that Ida and her family will continue to struggle to survive.
Ahmed Idris reporting there from the Chad-Sudan border. A woman is fighting life-threatening wounds and 4 others have been injured after an alleged stabbing rampage in Melbourne overnight. Police allege a man carried out random stabbings at 3 separate locations in inner Melbourne. Police are also linking a 4th stabbing attack in South Bank to the same man.
An alleged stabbing rampage over 3 hours across inner Melbourne. Police allege the attacker chose his victims at random.
On each occasion, the victims were minding their own business. They wouldn't have even known that they were about to be attacked. It was completely random.
In the first incident, a man was allegedly stabbed while walking in South Bank. Police say the alleged offender then appears to have used public transport to travel to the next crime scenes. CCTV appears to show another one of his alleged victims walking along King Street in Melbourne CBD, unaware that a stranger in a green hoodie is running up to him from behind. Moments later, people passing by realise he's bleeding. There were another 2 incidents in the suburb of St Kilda, including a couple walking along Dandenong Road. A 31-year-old woman suffered life-threatening injuries.
She's probably the one that's received the most significant wound. Her partner also had a serious, significant laceration to his arm.
All 5 alleged victims were hospitalised and are now stable. Police say the attacks don't appear to be terror-related.
He certainly is showing signs of either mental health or drug or alcohol or both related.
A Protective Services officer spotted the alleged offender at South Yarra Station. Officers then chased him on foot and used pepper spray when arresting him. A 31-year-old Melton man has been charged with 15 offences, including intentionally causing harm and recklessly causing serious injury.
He was located with a bag with multiple edge weapons in it, and it's quite possible that different edge weapons were used at each individual scene.
He's expected to face court tomorrow. Brianna Piazza, SBS World News.
A full recovery from Queensland's recent flooding and storms could take years, according to the Premier Stephen Miles. Well, funding to help residents impacted by weather events in the state's southeast has been unveiled today by the federal government.
Houses smashed, cars crushed. This is the aftermath of storms that have ravaged southeast Queensland. A heavy job ahead. 130,000 homes were left without power, now almost all reconnected.
99% of households and businesses have now been reconnected.
You can get that sense that things are starting to happen. It's terrific news.
After weeks of flooding, Cyclone Jasper in far north Queensland and severe storms, the full cost becoming clearer. Early estimates stand at more than $2 billion.
We've got 39 premises that are totally destroyed. 10 of those are in the southeast corner, 29 of those are in the far north of Queensland.
More than 150 homes have been severely damaged from the storms. The federal government pledging more support. A new one-off disaster payment of $1,000 for an adult and $400 for a child who've suffered serious injury or damage to their homes. People eligible in suburbs from 3 council areas. They can program the disaster recovery allowance for people whose access to work has been impacted. Up to 13 weeks of income payment, similar to the Job Seeker program for those working in the Gold Coast, Logan and Scenic Rim council areas.
The recovery from these 2 events in far north Queensland and southeast Queensland is going to take time. They are very significant events on a national scale.
How long the rebuild will take, not a question of months. Some homeowners already warned it could take more than 2 years.
It's true, recovering from this disaster, particularly when it comes to those severely damaged and destroyed households, that's going to take years.
The clean-up underway with a long way to head. Pablo Vinales, SBS World News.
Many in Australia's Ukrainian community are celebrating Orthodox Christmas today. That's despite a change made by Ukraine last year, formally switching it to the 25th of December.
A solemn service at what should be a festive time as the conflict in Ukraine rages on. At this parish of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Sydney's inner west, an ancient tradition is upheld. Orthodox Christmas on the 7th of January. Many still celebrating today, despite Ukraine recently moving the date. The country now formally marks Christmas Day on the 25th of December, adopting the Western Gregorian calendar and distancing itself from Russia and its religious traditions under the Julian calendar. Many parishes in the Ukrainian diaspora worldwide still rolling out the change of date. But church leaders say that is of secondary importance.
We don't celebrate a date, we celebrate an event. Hope that we can all be together, and I think that is the main aim, I think, of this process, is to come to an understanding of the idea of being one.
Still, some need time to adjust.
It's nicer on the 7th, you know. It's not the same.
Others say having Christmas in January has always helped strengthen ties to their homeland, but they welcome a shift away from Russian custom.
People think like this is Ukrainian, so they want to be more connected with Ukraine. So now we want to be as different as possible, even in some simple things.
Meanwhile, there are those who believe in a Christmas that's twice as nice.
We celebrate both. My husband was born here in Australia. We celebrate 25th of December, and I was born in Ukraine, so we still continue to celebrate.
The date change part of a wider campaign to assert Ukrainian identity in defiance of Russia's invasion almost 2 years ago.
Help Ukraine win!
Those gathered outside Sydney's town hall today not losing hope, as they strive to keep the war in Ukraine at the front of people's minds. Rochelle Harrison-Pless, SBS World News.
And also in Sydney, thousands of Greek Christians gathered for the Greek Epiphany Festival, celebrating the annual Blessing of the Waters ceremony. It marks the day when Jesus is said to have been baptised. Hundreds of believers raced for a cross, and according to tradition, the person who fetches it, the cross that is, will be blessed for the year.
It is something that I believe they regenerate all of us, and it will be a chance for all of us to be united under the Christ and under the Church.
A similar event was held in Melbourne yesterday. This year, the Greek Orthodox Church is marking its centenary celebrations of its archdiocese in Australia. Overseas and Eastern Orthodox Christians have begun their Christmas celebrations. The mood, though, was sombre for many who were marking it in the middle of conflicts.
Christmas Eve in Russia. President Vladimir Putin joins families of soldiers who died fighting in his so-called special military operation in Ukraine, their faces devoid of any Christmas cheer.
I'm not going to touch on the delicate, difficult even, things concerning your families, not today, on the holiday eve. But I want to assure you, We will always have your back.
Time too for prayer in a private service within the presidential residence. The gathering was far more elaborate at Moscow's Christ the Saviour Cathedral.
Важно, очень важно молиться за нашу Россию. Это очень важно. Почему важно? Потому что хочется мира, чтобы над нами было мирное небо.
In Ukraine's Pokrovsk district, emergency workers spent Christmas Eve searching through the rubble. The regional governor saying 11 people, including 5 children, were killed in Russian shelling. In Kyiv, traditionalists gathered for church services.
Перемоги, звісно, перемоги України у цій війні і щоб був мир нарешті, всі могли спокійно жити, створювати.
Midnight Mass was held at the Church of the Nativity in the West Bank city of Bethlehem, a backdrop of war for this region too.
شو كان يكون كتير حلو في كشافات، في شجرة، في أطفال ينبسطوا كتير هدايا، اليوم ما في ولا شعرنا هالسنة بعيد ولا إشي.
Bethlehem's mayor saying a decision was taken to cancel all festivities surrounding Christmas as the city is in mourning. Tanya Dandrinos, SBS World News. A Chinese exchange student who was reported missing last week has been found in a tent in the mountains in Utah. Police say he was the victim of what they call a cyber kidnapping.
This morning, a 17-year-old Chinese exchange student discovered camping in the woods in Utah, cold and alone. Now safe and reunited with his host family after police say he was the latest victim of a fraud called cyber kidnapping. Kai Zhang was first reported abducted by his family in China on December 28th after they received a photo that showed their son, who was in the U.S. to experience life at an American high school, had been kidnapped. His parents sent $80,000 to bank accounts in China to pay his ransom. But it turned out the family were victims of a cyber kidnapping scam, where kidnappers target foreign exchange students and their families, telling each that the other is in danger. They then convince the student to isolate themselves and send pictures or cell phone videos, making it appear they're being held captive to their parents, who in turn hand over ransom money electronically.
Actors are able to manipulate both a victim and their family into believing that something has happened to the victim.
Experts say these criminals are cunning, likely targeting people who are out of their element, people who are new to the country and are unfamiliar with law enforcement. After paying the ransom, Kai's parents notified his Utah high school, who contacted local police and Kai's host family, who said there was no evidence he had been forcibly removed from the home.
The reason why they have him seclude himself in the woods or away from somebody, everybody in society, is so they can continue to extort as much money as possible.
Cyber kidnapping scams can be a lesson to families of kids studying or even working abroad.
Eva Pilgrim reporting there. Local Thai communities are battling to build better defences against the tide and extreme weather. Ancient cultural and religious temples on the east coast of the country are suffering from the impact of rising sea levels.
A monk tries in vain to push back floodwaters. This is now an annual occurrence in many areas along Thailand's coast. Rising sea levels, fiercer storms and heavy rainfall, the growing impact of global climate change. Even at this temple, 50 kilometers inland, rising sea levels are having a devastating impact. 400-year-old murals on the temple walls depicting the 10 reincarnations of Buddha. The abbot says they've deteriorated rapidly in recent years because of salt water seeping in through the foundations, and soon they may be gone.
The murals have been partially restored. Last year, we got a small budget from the Department of Fine Arts. If there was no restoration, the cement would look like what we see outside, decaying away. I am scared that all of the murals will fall apart.
The culprit's the canal that runs outside the temple. 20 years ago, this was freshwater. Now salt water comes with the high tide. On the coast, another temple under threat from the rising seas. 20 years ago, a thriving community lived around it. Now all that remains are the telegraph poles that run along what was the main road. This temple on the coast has almost lost the battle against rising sea levels. Today, the entrance here, 20 years ago, it was all the way down there, 1.5 meters below where I am now. Wisanuk grew up here, but with the rest of his community, he had to flee inland. He shows me the damage the salt corrosion has done to the temple walls and the iron structure inside. But local people say they're not going to abandon what remains of their community.
We chose to protect this temple despite the fact that it's more expensive than building a new one. This building has sentimental value and historical value, and it's a monument to the environment that shows the coastal erosion that happened in this community.
Now the monks are working hard to undo the damage of the corrosion and build better barricades against the waves. In the battle against climate change, faith is one thing, but it also involves a lot of hard work.
Tony Chung reporting there from Samut Prakan in Thailand. Experts are hailing what they're calling the future of electronics, the first functional semiconductor made from graphene. Nearly all modern electronics rely on silicon, but it's thought they won't keep up with the future demands of computing speed.
A single sheet of carbon atoms, held together by the strongest chemical bonds known. Graphene is a form of carbon. While being just one atom thick, it's 200 times stronger than steel. Its potential to be a faster and more energy-efficient semiconductor is what has excited scientists.
So we don't really know where this ultimately is going to end, but we know we're opening a door in a major paradigm shift in doing electronics.
Semiconductors are materials that conduct electricity under specific conditions. Every time we use a credit card, start the car or use a smartphone, we use a silicon one. The innovation comes at a time when silicon is reaching its limit.
The good thing about graphene is not only can you make things smaller and faster and with less heat dissipation, you're actually using properties of electrons that are not accessible in silicon.
It's a future America hopes to pioneer, recently announcing $14 billion for a semiconductor research center. And there are hopes of making New York the semiconductor capital of the world.
The Chinese in particular are attempting to dominate this industry. And guess what? We have no intention of letting that happen.
The discovery was a collaboration between the team in the US and Chinese scientists. A collaboration that's being encouraged despite political differences.
The semiconductor industry is highly globalized. Any behavior that violates market rules and fragments the global semiconductor market will not only harm the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese companies, but will also affect the interests of semiconductor companies in various countries, including the US.
A new model that could give the world more for less. Achola Rock, SBS World News.
Coming up next, India's spacecraft settles on a spot to study the sun. And Australia's elite cyclists pay their respects to a fellow competitor. India's solar mission has reached the sun's orbit after a 4-month journey. The spacecraft blasted off in September. It's now taken up a position 1.5 million kilometres away from Earth, which is about 1% of the Earth to sun distance. From there, it will observe the sun for about 5 years. Time now for sports news with Brianna Holden and Brie. Australia's cycling champions have been crowned today.
Janice, that's right, and it wasn't easy going with wet weather in Victoria, making the course just outside Ballarat trickier to handle. The women's road race began in a sombre mood, with the peloton observing a minute's silence for champion cyclist Melissa Hoskins, who died at the age of 32 last week. The race itself saw Ruby Roseman Gannon back up her win in Friday's Criterium, but it was a lot closer this time around.
Yeah, I just wanted it so bad today, and I had amazing legs. I mean, it helped that I was always up the road on the climb, but yeah, I couldn't thank my team enough. Like, really, really, this is the best group. And yeah, I'm just in shock in the last time in Ballarat. Like, it means a lot. I think it doesn't feel real.
The men's race was a familiar one to cycling fans. Luke Plapp won his third straight title alongside teammate Chris Harper. Australia is set for a new top 10 tennis player. Alex de Minaur will be the first Australian man in the top 10 since Leighton Hewitt when the Australian Open gets underway. It was confirmed after he beat world number 7 Alexander Zverev in the United Cup semi-final. Despite his efforts, Australia failed to reach the title decider.
And there it is. Does it for Australia.
Alex de Minaur on a roll, defeating Olympic champion Alexander Zverev after wins over Taylor Fritz and Novak Djokovic. The Demon marches into the Australian Open with success over 3 top 10 players inside a week. And he did it the hard way.
Oh, wow. He can hit the flat one, though.
From a set down, he powered back to claim a 2-1 victory in front of an electrified Sydney crowd and become Australia's first top 10 men's player since 2006.
It's what I worked so hard for. It's another milestone, but it doesn't finish there. Job's not done. We keep on improving, we keep on trying to get better, and I'm going to enjoy this Aussie summer, that's for sure.
That levelled the tie after an earlier loss for Ajla Tomljanovic, which meant it all came down to the mixed doubles. Matt Ebden and Storm Hunter fell in straight sets. Germany now faces Poland for the title. Elsewhere, last year's Australian Open champion Aryna Sabalenka took on Elena Rybakina, this time in the final of the Brisbane International. Last year's Australian Open runner-up in the mood for revenge. The first set took just 24 minutes. A frustrated Sabalenka called for a medical timeout in the second, but there was no stopping an on-fire Rybakina, who now enters the Australian Open a firm favourite.
A masterclass.
Coco Gauff also marked her intent with a come-from-behind win over Alina Svitolina in the ASB Classic final.
Goes back to back.
It may not have been pretty, but the Socceroos secured a win in their final warm-up game before the Asian Cup in Qatar. Graham Arnold's men proving too strong for Bahrain with a goal in each half. The match saw Sam Silvera make his first start for Australia, the 23-year-old with an immediate impact as he created the first clear opening for Craig Goodwin. And it was a Goodwin cross that eventually ended up in the back of the net thanks to a deflection. Mitch Duke then scored a 12th goal for his country to seal victory in the second half.
Against these type of nations, how they sit back and, you know, as much as you can do presentations and train it and get ready for it, it's always great to play against opposition that play that way. So it was a perfect game that we could have had leading into the Asian Cup.
Australia plays its opening game of the Asian Cup against India on Saturday. Melbourne Victory coach Tony Popovich has revealed a dramatic late win against Perth came against all odds. Ben Falami's 96th minute winner lifted Victory to the top of the A-League ladder. That's despite the bulk of the squad battling through illness, while the league's top scorer, Bruno Fornaroli, is also missing on international duty with the Socceroos. The Adelaide 36ers have sprung the biggest shock of the NBL season, downing runaway leaders Melbourne United. The visitors kept it tight until Trey Kell landed his 4th three-pointer of the game to snuff out any chances of Melbourne denying Adelaide the upset. It was the second loss on the road in Melbourne's last 3 games. Jason Day has moved into contention at the season-opening Century Tournament in Hawaii. While the Whales were enjoying themselves just off the coast of Kapalua Golf Course, the Australian fired a birdie at the last to move within 3 shots of leader Chris Kirk. Akshay Bhatia kept his growing army of American YouTube fans happy by moving 1 shot off the lead. The 21-year-old would become the second youngest winner of the tournament behind Tiger Woods if he can win the $5.4 million winner's check. A Taekwondo centre hidden in Melbourne's southeast has become a refuge for a group of talented female Afghans who fled the Taliban to pursue their passion. A 16-year-old who represented Afghanistan's national team among those now inspiring others to take up the challenge.
It's an ancient art form that masters discipline and balance to empower self-defence. Renowned for its high-flying kicks and intensity, here Taekwondo's fighting techniques are being carefully practiced. 16-year-old Fatima Ahmadi executes them with fierce precision. Before the Taliban's takeover, she represented Afghanistan's national team.
Growing up in a country like Afghanistan, that violence and gender inequality was the most common things. Taekwondo provided me with an escape from that sort of environment.
But that all changed 3 years ago. Facing a ban on female sport under Taliban rule, Fatima is now among 7 evacuated Taekwondo athletes now training at the centre in Melbourne's southeastern suburbs. Since arriving here, her competitive drive has flourished. A new life and a new chance to keep pursuing her passion.
I really want to represent Australia in competitions because I cannot represent my country anymore.
Shakiba Faladi shares that burning desire to make the most of her opportunity. The 21-year-old is another from Afghanistan who is thriving in her training.
If I was now in Afghanistan, I wouldn't be able to be where I am today.
The girls like Shakiba and Fatima, they lost their hope in Afghanistan. They have a goal in their life. They have a dream.
As well as competition success, the two athletes have been recognised for their role in inspiring other young girls to take up the challenge, something valued even more highly given the hardline stance against participation in sport they would otherwise face in Afghanistan.
They've truly shown us what, even if you're going through a tough time, especially coming from Afghanistan, a country where this isn't an opportunity given to them, I think it makes me even more grateful.
Where did you get that gold from?
I got it from one of the state competitions when I was back in Afghanistan.
As their trophy cabinets swell, they say equally important to the accolades is the message their success sends.
I want my journey and my achievements and my voice to portray hope, motivation.
You can't start from a country with the less opportunity. If I could do that, every single person can do it as well.
Powerful female sport role models in defiance of the Taliban. Tom Stainer, SBS World News.
South Africa's Ross branches celebrated victory in the opening stage of the Dakar Rally in Saudi Arabia. The 414-kilometre stage included challenging volcanic terrain, which saw several competitors brought down after riding over stones. Daniel Sanders ended the day in 9th overall, with fellow Aussie Toby Price back in 16th. Sanders says he's just happy to have survived unscathed.
It was brutal, but I just didn't want to crash, so that was the priority, and I finished in a not too bad spot. So I'm happy to make it to the finish line without any scratches, so that's good.
The course made life hard for those in a car, with Carlos Sainz overcoming obstacles to record a second-place finish, but the stage win went to surprise packet Guillaume de Mevius of Belgium. And viewers can see daily highlights of the great race on SBS from 5 p.m. and, of course, on demand. And that is the day in sport, Janice.
Thanks so much, Bree, for the update. Well, coming up, the weather details and lines in to catch the perfect fish beneath the ice. Time to check the weather forecast now. In the major centres, rain increasing in Sydney, possible storms and heavy falls ahead for Canberra, rain and a possible storm in Melbourne, wet in Hobart, possible morning showers ahead for Adelaide, the sun will shine in Perth, a shower or two and a possible storm for Darwin, and wet weather also for Brisbane. Checking conditions further afield now, showers in Port Vila, thunderstorms in Nundy at top of 32 degrees and partly cloudy in Wellington. To Southeast Asia now, partly cloudy in Bangkok, thunderstorms in Kuala Lumpur, cloudy in Denpasar, thunder in Honiara. Further north now, sunny but a low of 3 degrees ahead for Tokyo. Cloudy skies in Hong Kong, partly cloudy in Hanoi and fine weather in Manila. Heading west now, grey and cloudy in Beirut, grey skies too for Baghdad, foggy in New Delhi and overcast in Mumbai. Checking conditions in Europe now, overcast skies in Berlin, a few showers in London, sunny skies in Warsaw, Paris and Madrid, rain in Rome and clear and fine in Athens. To Africa now, the sun will be out in Algiers, thunderstorms in Lagos, showery in Nairobi and rain to hit Johannesburg. In South America, cloudy skies in Caracas, grey too in Bogotá and La Paz and a rainy one in Rio. For North America, snowfall in Vancouver, sunny and clear in San Francisco, fine in Washington, snow in Denver and a few showers to hit Havana. Well, thousands of people have dropped their lines on a frozen stream in the Gangwon province of South Korea for an annual ice fishing event. People try to catch trout through holes cut in the surface with hooks or even their bare hands. And organisers say climate change is making the festival more difficult though, as this year the ice was not as thick as previous events. That is The World this Sunday. I'll be back with news updates right throughout the evening here on SBS, but for now, from the World News team, good night.